industry experts from powerhouse brands. Earned Summit, Building a Community by Tribe Dynamics.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to let all of the participants stream in here for about a minute, and then we will get going. And just for those that missed me earlier on, my name's Connor. I am the co-founder of Tribe Dynamics. And for today, we'll be talking about retention. So I'll go ahead and give it another 20 seconds, but considering the timing of these is pretty fast, we'll probably get it started right away. All right, looks like the numbers are starting to stabilize. So today, what we're going to be talking about is a concept called retention. So retention has historically been used to refer to customers. So do you retain your customers? Do they stay with you? Do they buy more from you over time? Do they buy less from you over time? So that's what we're going to be covering today. Before we get into that, what we're going to do is quickly define just one term that you're going to see in this presentation a lot. It's the term EMV, or earned media value. So the way that earned media value is measured is we look at an individual piece of content that mentions a brand. In this case, it is a YouTube video that mentions Wet n Wild. This YouTube video got about 3 million views, which is a lot of views. But that number in the middle is a number that really kind of stands out to me. So I got about 54 years in terms of watch time, which is, not only is that basically an entire human life spent watching this one makeup tutorial, but more importantly, it's about half the watch time of a Super Bowl advertisement. And a typical Super Bowl advertisement would cost you about $5 million. So what we would do is value this video for Wet n Wild. So in this case, we'd value this video around $150,000, which is a heck of a lot less than $2.5 million. But that at least gives you an idea of what that EMV number is. Realistically, you could plug in any number: views, posts, impressions, they all work for what we're going to talk about today, but I wanted people to know what that was. Okay, so let's talk about retention now. This is a phrase that I really like. It says, growth is good, but retention builds empires. And the reason that retention builds empires is that, getting new customers is really expensive, right? So getting somebody new or to come into your brand costs a lot of money in terms of advertising, versus getting somebody who already loves your brand to continue to talk about your brand or continue to buy from your brand is much, much cheaper. Second, there are a finite number of customers in the world that will ever buy your product. So there are only, call it 3,000 to 5,000 brands that will ever really buy from Tribe. In the same way that there are only so many brands that or only so many customers that are ever going to buy a lipstick from Chanel. Right? And if you treat them like they're an infinite resource, it just doesn't work very well. 3, happy customers tell friends. So if you retain your customers, meaning they continue to buy from you over time, it's more than likely that they're happy with what they're buying from you. And so they are very likely to tell their friends, which makes acquiring new customers much cheaper. Finally, if you look at any of the research as it relates to customer satisfaction and retention, if a customer stops buying from you, so they buy your eyeshadow, and then they don't come back and buy it again, it's likely that they didn't have a great experience with that product. And so, and people love to complain. So unhappy people like to talk about their poor experiences much more often than people like to talk about their happy experiences or the products that they love. The reason this matters is that you've seen the exact same patterns in influencers, in the influencer space, as you do in the consumer space. So the brands that have grown consistently over the last 3 years, meaning they've grown every single year in their influencer coverage, have retained significantly more influencers than the brands that have not grown every year for the last 3 years. So what you're seeing here is that the brands that have grown for 3 years in a row retained about 10% more influencers than the brands that did not. And although 10% doesn't sound like a massive number, it has dramatic effects that we'll look at later on in the presentation. But another way to think about it is for Tribe, if we were to improve our retention by 10%, say we were to go from 85% to 95% customer retention, or 90 to 100, that would roughly double the valuation of Tribe over the next 5 years. So it more than double how valuable our company is if we were able to retain just 10% more customers. And I think most importantly, when it comes to EMV, one of the problems that we've run into is we know that EMV is generally correlated with business success. If the number goes up, it is good for you. The problem is that it was kind of difficult to understand how you get there. So how do I get that EMV number to go up over time? And it turns out that retention is just incredibly linked with EMV. So if you are retaining your influencers, your EMV will go up. And if you are not retaining your influencers, your EMV will go down. And the nice part about this is that retention is a much more actionable and direct metric that I think people have conceptualized or really understood quite quickly. So this is Bulgari over the last, over 2019. You'll see as retention goes up, EMV goes up. As retention goes down, EMV goes down. And I can show you every single graph we pull looks like this. So this is Too Faced. This is Kendra Scott, right, which is in the jewelry space. This is Gucci. Notice as EMV goes up, retention goes up. As EMV goes down, retention goes down. This is Drunk Elephant, which is in the skincare space. As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. And if you were to look at the different categories, the retention isn't the same for all of them, right? So in categories where there is significantly more content created, like fashion or makeup, the retention rates will be higher because people post more frequently. Versus skincare, they'll be a little bit lower. But looking at these numbers, these are the top, this is the kind of monthly retention metrics for the top competitors in each category. So 70% for fast fashion, 58% for skincare, on down the list. And where this becomes really interesting is if you look at the top brands in every category, Fashion Nova is retaining about 21% more influencers than their competitors. Tatcha is retaining about 11% more. ColourPop is retaining 15% more. Dior is retaining 10% more. And remember, 10% is a lot. It is a ton. It is not a small deal. And so what we want to do next is say, okay, so we've got these retention numbers. We know that retention is good, but how do we actually drive it? So the way that we have kind of approached this problem is to break the brand's communities down into a couple different cohorts or groups. So looking at Fashion Nova specifically, these numbers are going to look outrageous, but I assure you they are real. And for those that don't know Fashion Nova, they're the #1 brand we track across all categories. From a revenue perspective, there's rumors that they have doubled revenue every year for the last 3 or 4 years, up to a $2.5 billion run rate in cash, just basically all direct to consumer. So this is looking at Fashion Nova's community. So Fashion Nova has about 5,600 influencers that talked about them in 2018 and talked about them in 2019. So they stuck around, right? They were loyal to the brand. And what's phenomenal about that is the coverage that they provided to Fashion Nova almost doubled. So without adding anybody new to their ecosystem, they would basically double their EMV just because that group both grew themselves and talked about Fashion Nova a lot more this year than they did last year. In software, this would be referred to as net negative retention, or net negative churn, I should say, meaning you, without adding any new customers, you're going to make more money next year than you did this year because they're spending more. Additionally, they lost almost no one. Although they lost about 2,000 influencers, so that past group, 2,000 dropped off year over year, they were very much at the bottom end of the funnel. There's only about $85 million of EMV produced by that group, which is not a ton. Now, obviously, Fashion Nova still wants to know what that group is, and they probably want to try to reclaim those 2,800 people. But it's very, very good. And then third, that recent bucket. So these are recent influencers, meaning they talked about Fashion Nova in 2019, but did not talk about them in 2018. The reason they're not new influencers is they could have talked about them in 2017, theoretically. And so for these people, the goal is, how do I make sure they become part of my loyal group versus part of my past group? How do I make sure they stick around into 2020 and even grow the volume of content they are creating about me? So this number, their annualized retention, would be 159%, but meaning like they got 60% more EMV from the exact same people as they had from the previous year. And if you were to put those numbers, again, that 2 billion sounds ridiculous, and it is. To give you an idea of that, right? If we were to compare that to that one YouTube video I showed you earlier, that would be the equivalent of 16,000 of those YouTube videos, right? That YouTube video got about 3 million views. So I have 16,000 YouTube videos created with 3 million views, which would be the equivalent of 8,000 Super Bowl commercials. So if you were to do this all in YouTube content, it'd be the equivalent of 8,000 or 8,000 Super Bowl commercials. And remember, each Super Bowl commercial costs you $5 million. So it's about $40 billion worth of advertising. So we're probably very much undervaluing this, even though it seems absolutely outrageous. And I know that, again, EMV can sometimes be like a loaded term because obviously we use it a lot, but it's not used by everybody. So looking at it from another perspective, this is just post count. So last year they went from 95,000 posts up to 131,000 posts, which is massive, right? It's extra 40,000 posts from the same group of people. And so this is consistent across all major social metrics. So posts, impressions, total engagements, etc. You'll find the same patterns across all of them. And then the final thing I wanted to look at with Fashion Nova specifically is thinking about this concept of lifetime value. So one of the things that people get caught up in is like a campaign mindset or a short-term mindset. But to look at some of these influencers, right? Mia Sand talked about them 913 times from 2017 through 2019. That is an absolutely ridiculous number. And that powerhouse marker in the middle means that she has over 1 million fans. So somebody with over 1 million fans has talked about Fashion Nova close to 1,000 times in the last 3 years. That is just insane. And since 2017, there are about 766 influencers that have talked about Fashion Nova at least 100 times each. Which again is just, it's mind-boggling, right? But you can't view these as short-term relationships, short-term campaigns. They really do build on top of each other. And then finally, I want to look at a brand that's having some retention issues. So this is a brand, I'm going to kind of obscure the name because I don't want to try to call anybody out. But what we're seeing here with this brand, this is one of the top 15 or so brands that we track. And what we're seeing is the opposite, right? So we're seeing an incredible amount of churn. So their retention, as opposed to going from 512 million to $1 billion in EMV, they actually lost about $100 million in coverage from their core community, right? That loyal community. And although they acquired about $92 million in new EMV from like new people that talked about them for 2019, that didn't even offset the losses in their core community. So they essentially drove in circles over the course of the year because they had a leaky bucket when it came to managing these influencer relationships. And so their annualized retention, as opposed to being 159%, would be 72%, which is not very good. And again, I think the nice part, we actually looked at it. We were really concerned. We were really hoping that our clients did a better job of retention than our non-clients. Turns out they do. So on average, our clients will retain about 12% more influencers than those that do not on a monthly basis. So non-clients are about 53% and tribe clients are about 50 or 65%. And this is not something, it's not a selection bias thing. When people join with us, their retention goes up, and when they leave, their retention goes down. And this is really the problem that we've tried to kind of center around solving. And again, just to put that kind of 12% number into context, if we were to look at that same cosmetics brand who has a retention problem, if they were to get a 12% lift in their retention, that would be worth about $60 million in EMV around 21,000 pieces of coverage by their influencer community and around 1,500 influencer relationships, which is just a massive, massive gain. And so we'll send this around afterwards. If any brands are interested in looking at their retention metrics, our team can kind of walk you through that. Obviously, you have to be above a certain size in order for there to really be metrics worth looking at. But that's kind of the gist of it. And I think with that, we'll see if we have any questions. Only have maybe a couple minutes here. Let's see. I think we had one Q&A here. So the definition of a loyal influencer, somebody asked, this is somebody that has stuck around with the brand, meaning they talked about them, they mentioned them on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, last year, 2018, and they talked about them again in 2019. So they talked about them in 2 successive years. Yeah, so that's what the loyal influencer means. Okay, let's go back here. Oh, got a couple other questions. What tools do you use to track influencer retention? So, Tribe is a tool for tracking that kind of stuff. So those labels, that loyal, past, and recent influencers are filters within the software. We haven't really seen anybody else talk about this. I think we've done hundreds and hundreds of research reports over the years. This is the most important thing we've ever worked on by a wide margin. So it is so indicative of success and of the way that you should actually approach the problem, that it's frustrating that it took us this long to figure it out. So I don't know if there's anybody else out there doing it as of right now. Alyssa, what are some of the biggest factors that determine if an influencer remains loyal? I wouldn't say that we know why somebody sticks around or not yet, only whether they do or not. It will be something that we look into over time. How do you convert recent influencers into loyal influencers? The way that I would approach that problem is you should have an onboarding process. So if somebody talks about you for the first time, they should get a direct message from somebody at the brand. You should offer to send them other products that they haven't tried yet. You should kind of track them in either a Google spreadsheet or in a CRM system like we have, so that like, okay, this is somebody we want to convert to being a loyal influencer versus just somebody that recently popped up. Let's see. Let's see. Okay, I actually think we're running close on time. So I'll try to get responses to these questions afterwards. We'll try and send them around with the webinar itself. But thanks so much for joining, guys. I really appreciate it. Hopefully this is useful, gives you another lens by which to think about the space. And again, we encourage long-term relationships, long-term, just thinking long-term in general. The value of LeBron talking about Gucci 10 times a year for the next 10 years is a really, really big deal. Thanks, Alyssa. All right, bye guys, let you go. Next session starts in 12 minutes. See you there.